Alrighty, so welcome everyone. Happy afternoon on this beautiful warm day. Welcome back to our winter plant talk series. Today is our last plant talk of the season, and we are wrapping up with some of our favorite tree people. So we will get to them in a second. But I just wanted to first say thank you to everyone who registered for one or more of these plant talks over the last few months, and also to those who made a donation. Thank you so much for that. That helps us keep our environmental education programs running, as well as our tree planting and our garden making. So we appreciate every dollar that comes our way. So thank you for that. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Michelle DeRusha with Nebraska Statewide Arboretum. You can watch recordings for all 8 of our plant talks that we did this winter over on our YouTube channel. We will drop that link into the chat, but all you have to do is search Nebraska Statewide Arboretum on YouTube to get to all of our videos. And there is actually a lot of great content over there, in addition to our plant talks. And then just to remind you one more time, I'm sure those of you who have been here to a number of plant talks are getting a little tired of my spiel, but Nebraska Statewide Arboretum is a nonprofit member organization. So if you're not a member of NSA, you can find out more about our different membership levels and benefits on our website, plantnebraska.org. And memberships support all of our work, our tree planting, our garden making, and free webinars like these plant talks and other events throughout the year. So thank you for that support. Just a reminder to keep your microphone on mute for now. And if you have questions for Justin, Bob, or Brad, you can either put them in the chat as we go along, or you can turn your microphone on after they are done presenting and ask your question in person. So today we are talking about oaks, willows, and cherry trees with Justin Evertson, Bob Henrickson, and Brad Kindler. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to NSA Sustainable Landscape Specialist Brad Kindler.
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle. Really appreciate this. Thanks everybody for joining us. I'm going to begin sharing my screen here, and let me know, give me a thumbs up when you can see my screen. Yeah, we're good. Okay. Put it in full screen mode here. Okay, we're talking oaks, willows, and cherries. That is the genus of Quercus, Salix, and Prunus. Okay, so I just want to give a brief introduction on why we chose these 3 tree species or 3 tree genera to have a conversation about this afternoon. Specifically, this comes out of the work of entomologist Doug Tallamy. And Doug Tallamy has written several books where he's advocating for the planting of native species as a way to promote biodiversity and overall ecosystem health. Doug Tallamy defines a native plant as a species that naturally occurs within a specific ecosystem without human intervention and shares an evolutionary history with other species in that area. These relationships make them crucial for the health and productivity of that ecosystem, and without them, the ecosystem services would collapse, threatening the systems that our communities depend on to survive. So this, in essence, is a relationship to something called the food web. And think of the food web as the physical earth that supports plants, and these plants support insects, and insects support invertebrates, or support vertebrates, ourselves, and many other animal species. Kind of the central dogma of what Doug Tallamy is talking about as an entomologist is just simply this, that tree leaves feed caterpillars, and birds eat caterpillars. And if you're a bird person, you should be interested in the trees that feed the caterpillars. And this is kind of his conversation about how is it that we can enhance and promote biodiversity throughout the landscapes that we live and recreate in. One of the interesting things that comes out of Doug's books is this conversation of Lepidoptera. That's an order of moths, it's a classification or an order of classification specifically for moths and butterflies. And he says Lepidoptera species are supported by these trees specifically. And if you look at his list of tree species that Lepidoptera are supported by, Quercus supports 517 different moths and butterflies. That's our oak species. Salix, 456, and cherries, 448. So we're using that as the basis for our conversation today. The species that we could be planting in our community so that we can improve caterpillar populations, which indirect have this whole cascading effect on the food web. If you look down at the very bottom, what do you see? Ornamental pear supports 0 caterpillar species. So one more reason to get rid of them in your landscape. Doug's group is called the Homegrown National Park. Here's his website, homegrownnationalpark.org. Their mission is to raise awareness and urgently inspire everyone to address the biodiversity crisis by adding native plants, removing invasive ones where we live, work, learn, pray, and play. Mission to regenerate biodiversity because all humans need healthy, productive ecosystems to survive. Amen. This is a lot of what the Nebraska Statewide Arboretum has been talking about for years, and we're excited to present some of this material to you today because it furthers our work and our passion for native species. Doug also talks about this idea of an ecoregion. If you go to his website, you download one of these templates here on where you live. You say, okay, I live in 9.2. This is southeastern Nebraska. This is called a temperate prairie. If you look at 9.1, you have west central semi-arid prairies and south central semi-arid prairies throughout the state of Nebraska. These are called ecoregions. The political boundaries of our state, these geometric political boundaries, they don't necessarily conform to the ecological plant communities that exist on the landscape. So we want to introduce this concept of an ecoregion because we're going to be talking about the species that you can find naturally growing in Nebraska. But if you're living in southeastern Nebraska, you might be looking to Iowa for some of these plant species, or to Kansas, or to Missouri, or to South Dakota, or to Wyoming or Colorado, depending on where you live in the state. So an ecoregion denotes an area of general similarity in ecosystem in the type, quality, and quantity of the environmental resources. These ecoregions it's a scientific designation to serve as a spatial framework for the management of our assets, mainly plant materials and water quality, but it helps us to assess and manage and monitor the ecosystem. They're based on the premise that ecological regions can be identified through the analysis of both biotic and abiotic material in the landscape. And those phenomena include the geology, the physiography, the vegetation, the climate, the soils, the land use, the wildlife, and the hydrology. So if you look at this ecoregions of Nebraska and Kansas, this is from the EPA's website. You can see over in the southeast part of the state, there's actually maybe some smaller ecoregions within that larger ecoregion that was identified in the last slide. But over here, you kind of zoom in on where Lincoln is at. That's where we're giving our presentation today. That might not be where you're listening from, but we're in the Luss and Glacial Drift Hills. And so we're thinking about plant communities that grow in this ecoregion when we're talking about our native species. The other concept that we want to introduce before we talk more about oaks, willows, and cherries is this idea of a keystone species. A keystone species refers to species with significant influence in their natural environment. They are critical to maintaining the diversity and stability of the ecosystem. Keystones are not always the most abundant species in the ecosystem, but their existence has a big impact on the local food web. This is what oaks, willows, and cherries are doing. They're not the most abundant trees out here, but they have a big impact on the biodiversity. Doug Tallamy's research at the University of Delaware has shown that a few genera of native plants, or keystone genera, form the backbone of these local ecosystems, particularly in producing food that fuels insect populations. Lastly, landscapes do not contain one or more species of keystone genera, or if they do not, they will have failed food webs, even if the other diversity of plants in that landscape is high. So we really want to think about including these keystone plant species in our landscapes. An example of an animal keystone species in the southeastern tallgrass prairie is the American bison, right? And maybe an herbaceous plant material as a keystone species is Missouri goldenrod, Solidago missouriensis. Okay, so in this presentation, we're going to be talking a little bit about scientific names, but just to assuage your fears here, I want to talk a little bit about why we're going to use them. Botanical nomenclature refers to a system of how plants are named. There are two parts, the binomial to a scientific name. It's very similar to how we're named. I'm Brad Kindler, right? There's many Brads out there, but there's only one of me, right? Just like plant materials, This naming convention helps us to keep from confusing species of plants that share the same common name. For example, is that an ironwood? Is that an oak? Although difficult to remember, with practice, scientific names become familiar, and it may be enjoyable at Spring Affair when you're talking with Bob about plants to use the scientific names. So we just want to kind of give a little bit of a disclaimer. Additionally, scientific names are incredible because they convey information to us about what we're looking at. Specifically, bur oak, Quercus macrocarpa. Quercus, the genus for all oaks, is the Latin word for oak. Macrocarpa is the Latin meaning large fruited and describes the large acorns that are characteristic of this oak species. So scientific names, yes, although difficult to initially remember, can actually convey a lot of information about the plant material itself and differentiate between what could be very similar species. And that is very evident in the genus Salix, which I'm going to be talking about in a little bit. But before we do, we're going to start with cherries. So this is going to be the genus Prunus. It's going to be presented by Bob Henrickson. He's the horticulture program coordinator, good friend of mine, and very knowledgeable on all things plant materials. So Bob, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Brad. I appreciate it. Let me share my screen now. Is that working?
We can see it.
All right. Am I on full screen? It doesn't look like it.
Not quite yet.
There we go. Let me try this. There we go.
Now you're
All
good.
right. Look, there's the arboretum, people. Hey, and I'm glad you mentioned the scientific names, Brad. I have a friend that was really into oaks, or still is, and he just always said, "I'm just a queer cuss." Get it? So you can call it the queer cuss arboretum. Hey, and I'll just echo what Brad was saying. You know, native woody plants supported 14 times as many species as introduced ornamental landscape plants. So wrap your brain around that. So yes, we can plant diversity, but if we don't include native woody plants, they're so critical. And of course, that's our state tree, the majestic eastern cottonwood. I think they took that picture out in the Danenbrog area when we were visiting Roger Welsh many years ago. And get this, and Brad said all it takes is a few keystone species, but only 14% of the native plants available in that region are making up 90% of all the caterpillar species. So it's not like you need a whole landscape of just native trees, but we just need more of them. This is a park in Danenbrog showing native bur oak trees where they were here before the town, and they're starting to decline. My guess is because of the human activity on the root systems, but I love this park because there's no turf grass underneath the trees. They just let the leaves drop and hopefully don't rake them away. Yeah, and like Brad said, butterflies lay their eggs directly on or near their food source. The caterpillars will eat only a single species. Others will eat a variety. Of course, we know the monarch and milkweed, but and Brad mentioned just like the keystone species of Forbes, goldenrod, which gets a bad rap, supports something like 120 different species, larval food source for 120 different species. That's impressive. So when we see this in a landscape, what's our first thought? You send an email to backyard farmers saying, what should I spray this with, right? And they're like, well, did anybody bother to ask, what is it? And any ideas? Go ahead and put it in the chat. I'll give you like 10 seconds what those larvae are. And I think they're on a hackberry. So you're looking at this going, oh man, your first idea is to go grab the sprayer and spray them. But guess what? It's the morning cloak. I know maybe you chimed in faster than I got it up there, but it is what it is. Yeah, those are morning cloak larvae. And again, in the past, we all would have just been rearing to spray those. Yeah, 30%, 37% of all animal species are insects. So I say create a landscape not just for pollinators, make it an insectary, I call it. So I'm growing bugs. A large percent of did I just say that as a horticulturist? A large percent of the world's fauna depends on these insects. And as Brad said, they're feeding them caterpillars. 96% of bird species in North America rely on insects to feed their young. They're not feeding them seeds, and caterpillars rule. So our larval insects become bird food, right? So no insects, no baby birds. And I want you to notice that robin in the lower left. Do you know what those caterpillars are? And that's what I would challenge is to start learning what the caterpillars are. Or how about even the sparrowhawk, the American kestrel in the lower right? even feeding their babies caterpillars, not mice or voles, right? So caterpillars hugely important to raising young. Those are pine sawfly larvae. That's how he was able to get a whole bunch of them in one bite. And when we see pine sawflies, our first intention is to spray that tree. And if it doesn't kill the sawflies, the birds are eating that tainted, insecticide-ridden, chemical-ridden caterpillar. And yeah, so one brood of chickadees might consume 6 to 9,000 caterpillars. And get this, they haven't counted, nobody's done research after they fledge, but chickadees will still feed their young 3 weeks after they fledge. So you can probably add another 6,000 caterpillars to that. So if we don't have these keystone species, the cherries, the oaks, and the willows around, if they're gone, you can kiss a chickadee goodbye. They'll feed young exclusively on caterpillars if they get a chance. They're large prey items, high in protein, high in fat, and they're soft. Much easier than shoving a beetle down the throat of your baby, right? And they're high in carotenoids. Us humans can't produce carotenoids. We have to get them through plant material, and the plant material that's what gives the bird its colorful plumage is the carotenoids in these caterpillars. Without carotenoids, it doesn't have bright, colorful plumage. The female says, nope, go away. I'm not interested in you. So it matters. But what really matters is you can have a big, beautiful oak tree like this one in Gehring, Nebraska, the only big bur oak we know of in all of Gehring. We were shown this tree, but underneath the tree is all nothing but turf. So if you plant a tree in a patch of turf grass with hard packed soil, tidied up and raked leaves every fall, you're doing no good for these lepidopter species. You have to landscape at underneath the tree out to the drip line as well. Leave the leaves, as we like to say, create a landscape that can accept those leaves and leave them. Because the critters like that depend on the ground foraging birds. Okay, so now I'll get into the cherries. There's not a huge group of cherries native to Nebraska. There's another group that, if I have time towards the end, that I'll call nearly native, meaning they're only a few counties away. And that's why I like Brad's comment. Plants didn't draw borders, humans did. So Northwest Missouri, in my mind, is just as much native to Nebraska as North Platte will ever be native to Lincoln, right? North Platte takes 3 hours driving west. If I drive 3 hours west, I'm in Des Moines. So you can look at it that way. All right, black cherry, and you oak people and you willow people, Brad and Justin. Fine, you have more Lepidoptera than the black cherry. All I know is the black cherry has fruit that my birds go crazy for when it's in fruit, and it's extraordinarily valuable, gets overlooked and underutilized in the landscape. It should be planted more, plain and simple. It's a fast-growing tree, tough tree, and it's native to the southeastern corner of the state. You can see it just kind of hugs the Missouri River line there. And so you can also see that's as far west as it gets pretty much in the United States. And then it reappears down here in Mexico, which I find interesting. And in Arizona, likely higher elevations is where it's at, and even a little spot down there in Texas. But it goes native all the way up into Maine and down into Florida. So it gets around. Basically, it looks like a choke cherry on steroids to me. It's like a big version of a choke cherry. This tree will get, I've seen the state champion, over 60 feet tall. So it needs space. It's a big tree. And it blooms early in the spring with these nice spike-like racemes, loaded with these little white flowers in this raceme, and very attractive to our native pollinators and honeybees, especially the small native bees that emerge early in the spring. It's a relatively early spring bloomer. If I'm wrapping my brain around it, I would say somewhere around early May, depending on the year, right? So yeah, very, very attractive to pollinators and loads of fruit. And you've maybe had black cherry soda, right? That's where it comes from. I've never foraged black cherries to make anything out of. It's always choke cherry, but interesting to note that 40 different species of birds will consume that fruit. And if you have a black cherry loaded with fruit like this on a Thursday, because I've done this and I've heard they're loaded, I showed up on Monday and they were all gone. So that's how desirable it is to wildlife, incredibly desirable. And they're small little fruits, and if you eat them raw, nothing special, just kind of like eating a choke cherry. It has some serious tannins in it, a lot of antioxidants, so it gives you a serious pucker power if you eat them raw. But certainly we can transform them into jams, jellies, wines, things like that. And there's some cedar waxwings taking advantage of the fruit. The birds love them, but it also serves as a host to an amazing array of butterflies and moths, more than 450 species. The eastern tent caterpillar is one of the reasons it's kind of frowned upon in the industry because it gets those eastern tent caterpillars. But get this, folks, over 60 bird species have been documented feeding on these caterpillars. I've witnessed it firsthand at Indian Cave State Park. We were looking at a black cherry to see if it had any fruit on it, and there's a big tent caterpillar nest in it, and we see a bluebird fly right up to it, hammer at that web with its beak, grab a mouthful of worms, and fly away. We were like, cool. So don't chastise the tent caterpillar. It's an important critter to wildlife. Okay. That's what the tent caterpillar looks like. And if you look like it up close, it's like going, wow, cool. Nature's artwork, right? Here's just some of these species that lay their eggs on the black cherry, the eastern tiger swallowtail probably being the most famous, but then the monarch lookalike, the viceroy, also lays its eggs on there. And you can see the viceroy pretty abundantly down at Indian Cave State Park, more so than other places. Why? Because black cherries are all over the place in Indian Cave State Park. When the bark is young, it has these lenticels on it, which I think is attractive on the young bark. And then the older bark, it's kind of this gray, flaky appearance to it on the old, mature bark. Attractive. Nice fall color on it. Gets oranges, kind of gets a kaleidoscope. It can have reds, oranges, and yellows all on the same tree, which I think is amazing. And it colors up earlier than most other trees, kind of like when your ash trees color up. Whoops, that's not supposed to be in there. But I'm also talking about they need wildlife needs places to hide. The shrubs provide that hiding place with their bushy leaves. And so consider that. Oh gosh, I wasn't supposed to have that in there. That was for these things, the thickets, because the chokecherry often gets maligned because it suckers. And I don't want to plant something that's going to sucker all over my landscape and take things over. And it's easy to control if you just surround that suckering shrub with a landscape bed. So let that chokecherry own a spot and keep it confined with a mowed edge all around that zone. And you can see where its native range is. I mean, chokecherry is basically in every county in Nebraska, so it knows how to get around. But I bet you could drive from the Kansas border to South Dakota border looking for chokecherry anywhere in eastern Nebraska and have a hard time finding it. So that's what Talamy's talking about with his homegrown national park. We can no longer rely on nature to just plant chokecherries because chokecherries are being eliminated more than they are being planted. So we need to plant them in town and take advantage of them as a keystone species because they're a top-notch keystone. Widespread species of butterflies, another early bloomer, early May, late April, depending on the year, loaded with flowers. I think the flowers are very attractive. Again, those spike-like racemes. And it is considered a keystone. Here's one of the caterpillars that, again, if you saw it in the past, you might break out the chemical and spray this until you learned it was a cecropia moth and said, oh, okay, that's that really cool, huge moth. So an important keystone. So this, when they're starting to ripe, they'll be kind of this reddish color, which is really attractive, but this is when the birds will start taking them. So when I want them ripe, I want them to look like this dark color right here to the right. So I could harvest them at this stage, but they're going to have more rich flavor getting them at this stage. The Dakota, so Native Americans, every plant had a name, every plant had a story, every plant had a use, and every plant had a song written about it. And some plants were so revered, they named whole months after them. And so you were pretty special if you had a month named after you. And the black chokeberry was one of those, the black chokecherry moon, which we call the month of July. Gathering and drying of the fruit made for a busy time. They made what's called wasna, which is kind of a pemmican. You can actually look it up online. There's recipes for wasna still today, and there's chefs actually making that in Native American restaurants. So it's like a pemmican or mincemeat, a dried cherry forming the fruit compound. Today we call them energy bars. And another thing is when the first day of the full moon, when the cherries were ripe, the Sundance, incredibly important time to the Lakota. When did it start? Well, the date was never set. It depends when the cherries were ripe, the first full moon. Of course, today we use them in jellies, sauces, wine, pie, syrup. Try making chokecherry syrup, which is just basically jelly that failed to set. And you do a tablespoon or two of that chokecherry syrup in ginger ale, and then you make what's called chokecherry fizz. The kids will down it. It's basically a two-tone drink because the syrup sinks to the bottom. There's a harvest of mine one year. Traditionally, it was used for centuries, high antioxidant content, healing properties. Why am I telling you this stuff? I feel like if we learn the importance of these plants, not just for wildlife, but for us humans put on this planet for us, we will respect them more and we'll be more apt to preserve them and we'll be more apt to plant them. This is considered a clingstone type of cherry, meaning it's hard to separate the fruit from the pit inside, like a sour cherry. So Native Americans would crush them, pits and berries and all, and they would dry them in the sun. The ultraviolet light of that sun denatures a toxic chemical that's in cherry pits. You can't eat cherry pits raw. It turns it into cyanide, but it gets denatured through drying or heating. And they knew that. It has the highest amounts of antioxidant called anthocyanin, shown to reduce the severity of colon cancer. According to oral traditions, Native American traditions, ground cherry pits acted as a colon cleanser. Numerous studies have shown the antioxidants have huge health benefits in cardiovascular, diabetic complications, and strong inhibitors of inflammation. Now, let me guess, before you heard about chokecherry, you had no idea it was nature's medicinal powerhouse. Inside each chokecherry pit, there's a small nut. That's the part that has rich in fats and nutrition. When we make jelly, we remove the pits. Drying mashed chokecherries adds a lot of depth of flavor, given that they have flavorful pits included. You can make your own wasna. So that's wasna. It's basically a patty of chokecherry candy with crushed pits. So again, they're toxic raw, but the drying process neutralizes that hydrocyanic acid. And you can make what's called wojapi. Wojapi, there's recipes online, and they actually used uh, tinsila, which is wild turnips, to thicken it, rather than today we'd use cornstarch. So look up wojapi, probably the most famous Native American condiment on the planet today, often served with wild game and whatnot. Incredibly nutritious. Yeah, the traditional leader stressed that reason for so many recent illnesses within the tribe was the lack of traditional foods being consumed, and specifically things like wojapi. Pretty cool, huh? You can even make your probiotic fruit vinegar with chokecherries. Look up chokecherry vinegar recipes, and it's a great thing for probiotic vinegar. Of course, my wife and I, she's a big winemaker, so we make wine with chokecherries. You can make chokecherry pit brandy. Go figure. You take the pits, grind them up in your Vitamix, strain out the flour, and then you can use that flour for a recipe. And then the pits you can save off to the side, uh, put them in alcohol. Whoops, you see the jar there with the alcohol, and then let it soak for 30 days, strain it, and you've got chokecherry brandy. How cool is that? Bring it to a potluck and impress your friends. Oh, you can even make chokecherry infused bourbon. Why not? So you fill the jar about halfway full of chokecherries and top it off with bourbon. My wife and I just bought a big bottle of bourbon last night to do this one on the right. Ha ha. Fun stuff. Okay, I know I'm yakking too much. How am I doing? 12:29. I got 1 minute. I'll go to wild plum. Wild plum is another great prunus, you guys, another keystone species. Fantastic shrub. Another one that is getting eliminated right and left out in the countrysides. We need to plant them in our cities. It is a fantastic small tree for landscapes, hosts dozens of larval insects. Uh, nature's powerhouse when it's in bloom. And then the sweet scent of a wild plum. Nothing is better than the sweet scent of a wild plum. And I love their look in the wintertime, cast with the snow, or even when it's not snowing, the dark, almost black color of a wild plum hedge. And here you see it's kept confined by a mowed surface. You can go ahead and confine this big area, but you're not growing anywhere outside of it because I'm going to mow you back. Hosts a lot of different Lepidoptera. You can see great fruit on there. Also, a revered plant amongst Native Americans, they named August after the wild plum, the red plum moon. How cool is that? When it bloomed in the spring, it was their calendar for when to plant corn. Today, it's when your neighbor's doing it, and it boasts one of the highest food values of any other fruit, 20% carbohydrates. Is that good reason to plant a wild plum? Heck yes. And it makes good wine too, by the way. All right, and good jelly. Western sand cherry is the last one. This is an awesome shrub native to Western Nebraska, short-lived here in the eastern part of the state. If you want a long-lived one, get the Pawnee Buttes variety. It seems to be a nice, good, long-lived variety, but Pawnee Buttes, I've never seen fruit on it like this. Makes a great pie. Terrible picture, but that's a wild sand cherry pie that I made years ago. All right, I was going to talk about nearly native species, but there's only a few on there, just very similar to wild plum and not really worth mentioning because I'm out of time.
Bob, thank you so much for that. Really appreciate the overview of the Prunus genus. So we're going to segue over here into Salix. You need to stop sharing here, Bob.
How do I do that? Let's see. Let me go back. Hold on. Bear with me, folks.
Now at the very bottom, there's
On
just
the bottom.
Yep, it says share or stop share.
Did that do it? No?
No,
No.
Wait.
there's a little
Let me
green
try this.
button on the bottom with an arrow on
Yeah,
it.
I see it.
So
I
click
see
on
it.
click on that and it should give you an option to or maybe the stop share. Look on the top of your screen. Is there anything on the top that says stop share?
You are screen sharing. Okay, let me try that. Yeah, I don't want to screen share. I know I'm not. I am. I don't want to. Oh, piss. Where? Jesus.
There you go.
Save the
Thanks,
day.
Anna.
All right. Bob, thanks
It's
again.
that
Really
it's that
appreciate
bright
that.
green, it's that bright red button to the side, right?
That's the one. That's the one. All right. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. Let's talk Salix for a little bit, and then we're going to have Justin come in and talk oaks. So Salix is found in every part of the world. There's about 350 species worldwide, 100 species native to North America. They're dioecious. They got a male pollen-producing component on one plant, and they have female organs or seed-producing plants on the other. They're in the Salicaceae family. That's the willow family, also shared with poplars and our native cottonwoods. 150 species of butterfly and moths use Salix genus plants. If you go to nativeplantfinder.org, that's also affiliated with Doug Tallamy, you can really get an overview of the insect species that use this. If you're interested in learning more about the insect species that engage or that interact with Salix, you can check out that website. Just like Bob was using, I'm going to pull most of my information about native ranges for these Salix species from the USDA plants database. That's the graphic on the right in this slide. Okay, so willows of Nebraska. Let me just say, I don't know if there's an expert out there on the willows of Nebraska, and I think I've maybe taken on a bit of a challenge here, but I'm going to try my best. There's 5 primary resources that I'm looking at here to put this presentation together. This is from Dr. Sutton and Walt Bagley, Woody Plants of the Central North Prairies. There's Woody Plants of the Central Plains, and then there's these other references that I'm going to use throughout this presentation. The reason that I had to look at a lot of different sources is because Salix is a widespread genus, and oftentimes there's a lot of hybridization that's going on between these plant species. The most prevalent one that we find in Nebraska, peach leaf willow. It's found statewide. It's often viewed as a weed tree, unfortunately. I'm going to have some more slide photos here to give you a bigger extent of what that looks like. It's a tree-form willow. It has low branching and often drooping look. However, it can reach 50 feet tall in ideal locations. It resembles our black willow, and interestingly enough, oftentimes people will refer to peach leaf willow as black willow. But we're here to correct the record. Most of what people are seeing in the landscape in terms of large tree form willows are peach leaf willow, and they're probably not black willow. The bark tends to cling to the trunk after death, and it makes it a good habitat for oyster mushrooms. Bob, you've probably found a few oyster mushrooms on willows before. I know that I have.
No doubt. And my brother said up north where I'm from in Dodge, they call the oyster mushroom the willow mushroom because of
There you
that.
go. There you go. So this is over in Fallbrook. This is right outside of Lincoln. Oftentimes in these kind of wet areas between these suburban houses, you'll find little draws. This is prime habitat for peachleaf willow, often viewed as weed trees. Unfortunately, this is out in the Sandhills. Justin and I are coming back from Rapid City the other day, taking about 65 miles an hour on Highway 83. Peachleaf willow growing out there adjacent to the train tracks, right out there in the middle of the Sandhills. Again, peachleaf willow is primarily the one that we're seeing in the landscape, although some people call it black willow. Correct the record, it's peachleaf. Black willow, go ahead and look at the map here. You can see it's pretty much confined to the extreme southeastern part of Nebraska. It's the largest of the willows, however. It can get 60 feet tall, 40 feet wide. There's a national champion in Michigan that's 114 feet tall. That's a pretty large willow. It's confused with peachleaf willow. It's easily propagated, as some willows are, by root or stem cuttings. Can be short-lived, susceptible to breakage, and it's not often used in landscape plantings. If you go down below the USDA plants database graphic here, you can see, if you zoom in, what counties black willow is native to. Okay, one little spot over there in Hall County where it's been found: Saunders County, Douglas, Arby, Cass, Otoe, Richardson, Nemaha, over in the southeast part of Nebraska. So primarily what we're seeing as we drive east to west in the state, we're seeing peachleaf willow, not black willow. Black willow is mostly found in the eastern part of the state. Here's a really interesting species, something that Bob's been promoting for a couple of years now, called prairie willow. This is Salix humilis. Over there in the backyard farmer garden on the left, this is an example of prairie willow that's growing. Its other common name is dwarf gray willow. It can get up to 10 feet tall, but here's what's interesting. You can hack this thing back and it responds to any kind of pruning that you want to do to it. So it doesn't have to be 10 feet tall if you don't want it to be. This is the interesting part about this plant. Unlike its water-loving relatives, Salix humilis is adapted to dry sites. I have it planted on the west side of a building, the west side of a metal building, in a very disturbed site, poor soils, and it's thriving. It does have a suckering habitat to it as well, or a habit, so it's going to move around. But like Bob said, if you don't want it there, just mow. Really interesting species. You can look at the map right here. It's native to the southeastern part of Nebraska. You find it up into the north central part of Nebraska as well. Bob, did you have any comments on that?
I was just going to say it might be native there, but it's very rare in nature. So just for posterity, we just need to be planting this more. And it may sucker, Brad, but it's a very slow, but it's a slow suckering. It's not going to take over your world, that's for sure.
That's right. That's right.
Again, hey, Brad, can I ask you a question, Justin?
Yeah, please, Justin.
What on black willow, where's the name black coming from? Do you know?
Good question. In any of the books, the entries that I was reading, I didn't necessarily see a description of why it's termed black willow. Do you got an anecdote there?
No, I don't either. I was just curious.
Okay, we're going to have to look into that. Not entirely sure myself.
Probably the bark.
Next one, sandbar willow or coyote willow. So this is Salix, exigua. Exigua. Thank you, Bob. All right. Or, interestingly enough, this plant has other synonyms in the botanical nomenclature. Salix interior. It's found all throughout Nebraska. Small shrub or tree. First plants become established on sandbars and it forms thickets. I'm sure we're seeing this as we drive over I-80 or we drive over the Platte River on I-80. Oftentimes we're seeing a lot of sandbar willow out on the Platte River. It has a thick matted root system. It's great for erosion control. It's identified by its narrow leaves and wide spaced margin teeth. And it has some hybridization that goes on from east to west across the United States. So you can see on this graphic on the right where you have Salix interior. And then, there's different varieties of it kind of hybridizing as you move to the west. Missouri River willow, really important willow species, again, to Native American tribes, often used in basketry. Its common name is also diamond willow, grows along Missouri and Mississippi rivers, can grow up to 20 feet tall, is characteristic by this red foliage that you have, this new red foliage. So this graphic here kind of shows where this new red foliage is peeking up. This is what really indicates that you're looking at Missouri River willow. Meadow willow, Salix petiolaris, large shrub or small tree. It's found in riverbanks and shallow streams, also used in basketry and can produce hybrids with Missouri River willow. Here's the thing, you guys. There are willows, again, all throughout Nebraska. Most of them are not necessarily ever very abundant, and many of them are just completely overlooked. And so what we want to try and do is foreground a little bit, a few of these. But the reality is that just by, seeing this presentation, it's going to be very difficult to say, oh, I think that's meadow willow out there. You're really going to have to get out in the landscape and really try to ID some of these plants. And the reason I say that is because even here at the Statewide Arboretum, we're trying to learn about these species because we are now realizing they're such an important part of an ecosystem as it relates to insects. Carolina willow. Okay, listen, there's a few books out there that says that this is native to Nebraska, but if you go to the USDA plants database, Carolina willow is not native to Nebraska, except in this very extreme southeast corner in Richardson County. It's a small tree. It's probably very similar to black willow and peachleaf willow. Here's the thing. It is a larval host of many, many different moths and butterflies, specifically red-spotted purple. This is a picture that I took in Nebraska City. Not very common to see a red-spotted purple butterfly, but when you do, you say, you think they would have gave it a different name, right? Because it's almost entirely blue. But it's a really awesome butterfly. So, this plant is showing up, and it's larval host to a couple of different species out there. Another one to look for when you're driving around the landscape. One I wanted to note here before we get on to oaks is yellow willow. I've never seen this in the wild, but it does exist out there. The USDA plants database is showing us that it's fairly common across the state of Nebraska. It has tough and flexible branches used in basketry. There's kind of this really appealing dark green foliage with the shiny yellow branchlets, but it's also host to what is called a gall gnat midge. Okay, this little midge will sting yellow willow, and it produces this fascinating form called a willow pine cone gall. Something to look for when you're out there. There are many galls that occur on willows, but this pine cone gall is just associated with the gall gnat midge. Really interesting kind of ecological relationship, something you might not think about. But again, this little midge is stinging that willow, and it's laying its seed inside there, or laying its egg, and that is producing a place for it to grow its larval stage. Bebb's willow in the far west part of Nebraska. I put this one up here because it's native to the western part, and it's also considered one of these diamond willow species. So it makes these really interesting walking canes where you kind of have this braided look between dark wood and light wood. So it's highly desirable for people who would like to carve wood and make walking sticks. Really interesting plant. Out in western part of Nebraska, it's tough to get things to grow pretty tall, but look at this thing. That's got to be 8 or 10 feet tall right there. Bebb's willow. Okay, now, this is the last slide. I know what you're saying, Brad. I'm from Nebraska. There's one more willow that you didn't talk about. What about red willow? Well, what is red willow? Well, okay, we're pretty sure that red willow is actually red osier dogwood, not a true salix, but in the Cornus family. Red Willow County, formed in 1873, was named for Red Willow Creek. The name is reported to be a mistranslation from the Dakota Indian term Chanchalawakpala, which means red dogwood creek. So not necessarily Red Willow County, but red osier dogwood is growing along the creek. What is an osier? Okay, this is kind of, it took me down a little bit of a rabbit hole here, but in Old English, an osier would be an English term for a willow shoot, right? Or a willow tree. And so when Europeans came to the United States, they may have called this red willow, but it's not necessarily taxonomically related to the other salix species that we find in North America. Okay. That's an overview of the salix in Nebraska. There's about 9 different species that we talked about. Quite a bit of diversity out there. It's your challenge to figure out what you're looking at this summer when you find a salix in the landscape. We'd like to know because we want to try and learn more about these as well. Justin's going to present a little bit about oaks, and then we're going to take any questions that you might have.
All right. Thanks, Brad. That was awesome. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. See if we can share this. Is my screen sharing?
It is.
All right. Awesome. That was great, Bob and Brad. We're not saving the best for last. We're just saving the oaks for last. And I do love some oaks, and it seems like people who become tree nerds often gravitate to oaks. I'm not sure why that is, but I'm one of them. And I think partly that's because if you think about the language of oaks that we think about, majestic, bold, sturdy, gnarly, beautiful, long-lived, cool, evocative, inspiring, vital, all those things come to mind. So we kind of gravitate to oaks. Here's a couple pictures of two different types of live oaks. On the west is the Eastern Virginia live oak, those southern plantation trees that we're used to. The Johns Island angel oak on the upper right is a well-known North American ancient tree. And then on the right is some live oaks from the Rocky Mountains. Believe it or not, these have semi-evergreen foliage and can grow in southern and western Nebraska. So we've got our eyes on them. Oaks can grow big and old, obviously, or of course, but they range in size from over 100 feet tall to low spreading things, and they range all over North America. I mentioned here the national champion bur oak in Missouri is 90 feet tall with a 24.5-foot trunk circumference. Nebraska's largest bur oaks are about 80 feet tall with a 100-foot spread and 20-foot trunk circumference. And we're looking for the next Nebraska champion because our old one blew over in a storm down near Peru a couple of years ago. Oaks can literally live for centuries, 1,500 to 2,000 years old or older. And we'll talk about one of the oldest ones in Nebraska that we know of here in a little bit. Bob and I were fortunate to be out into central Illinois a few years ago, visiting the Star Hill Forest Arboretum with Guy Sternberg, and he took us to some native bur oaks in that area. These were some that have the lore of Abraham Lincoln camping underneath their boughs. And so this great big one they call Josephine is thought to be over 400 years old. Here's one closer to home, just outside of Columbia, Missouri, the national co-champion bur oak. Brad and I were able to visit it last fall, 24-foot trunk circumference. It's on the way out because it's lived a long life. It's been hit by lightning and it's in a farm field. It's been flooded, but it's hanging on 400 years later. So oaks are fascinating. And here's just a few quick fun facts. Quercus, the genus name, is actually Celtic in origin, meaning beautiful tree. Believe it or not, there are 600 species of oaks worldwide, primarily in the Northern Hemisphere. 200 of those are in North America, with over 90 in the U.S. In Nebraska, we have 7 native within our borders, primarily the southeast part of the state. But there are another 6, just like Bob and Brad both said, another 6 that are within our ecoregions. Oaks are highly variable and promiscuous, so just be aware they're often hybridizing out in nature and giving us some fun hybrids we could talk about. The acorns are edible, not just to wildlife that we're celebrating today, but to we humans. And I think, Bob, you've probably made some or had some acorn flour pancakes. I've had pancakes from acorn flour. Or you want to talk about that quickly, Bob?
Yeah, I didn't make it myself, but a friend brought me some flour, and yeah, you mix it with conventional flour to get it to rise because it doesn't have any leavening in it, but it tasted like buckwheat pancakes.
Yeah. Yeah, let's beat a squirrel to those acorns and let's start eating them ourselves, right?
Yeah.
Several of these species are evergreen, or here's a term you might want to know, marcescent. They hold their leaves into winter even when they're dried, like the shingle oak. And that can be a good thing for wildlife habitat, and also thinking about insects and coverage in the following winter. Also, windbreaking. Oaks are generally keystone species. They really do represent, when you have an oak hickory woodland, capstone species doing a lot to sustain biodiversity. And then unfortunately, global warming is really revving up some dieback of some of our species because they're just, they're stuck where they are. They can't move, get up and move. So they're caught in droughts and things like that. Here's the idea of edible acorns. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but the Native Americans sure prized the acorn for edibility. Just be aware the white oaks are probably easier to use. They're tastier. They don't have as many tannins, but you can make the red oaks work for you too if you leach all the tannin and the bad taste out of them. So here's a dozen native and near native oaks for Nebraska. We're not going to spend a lot of time on any one of these, but just fly through them and show you what they are. There's 12 of them right here that we could say are native within our ecoregion. And I always start with bur oak. Holy cow. As Brad mentioned, Quercus macrocarpa, big fruited tree. It gets the name big fruited tree because the trees in Texas and Oklahoma have acorns the size of golf balls or bigger. By the time the tree reaches Manitoba, Canada, The acorns are actually marble size, so it depends a little bit where they come from. It's widespreading from Texas to Manitoba, Canada, and across the eastern Nebraska up along the Niobrara River, even out into Dawes County near Chadron is probably the last remnant pocket of oaks in northwest Nebraska. We got to see them late last summer. That was a bucket trip idea for me. And there's Brad looking down on the Niobrara River Valley near Valentine, and that's a blending of oaks and ponderosa pine. Look at these big trees that we have right here in Nebraska. Fairmont on the left, Wilderness Park there in the middle. Bob took that picture. So these trees are ancient. Both of those trees are probably at least a couple hundred years old, here long before white man came and settled it. And then on the right is my son against the wolf oak at Ponca State Park. We know it was born in 1644. Look at that boy. He's 10 years old and now he's 35 years old. And he gave me these two grandkids up here. And unfortunately, that tree's dying. So I'm not going to be able to get my grandkids on that tree like we had him. Brad and I were just out to Milford yesterday, Brad and Toby and I, and we got to see some really cool. Every town in Nebraska has some neat bur oaks, and sometimes they're the most prominent tree in town, but they're never really widespread or in great abundance. But here is a tree on the Milford Southeast Community College campus. I just love its low spreading nature. Bur oaks keep their heads down because they're a prairie species, and they have to resist all that wind blow out here on the prairies and also deal with forest or prairie fire. Brownville, Nebraska, and then Bemis Park in Omaha on the right has the old Druid oak dated to the 1780 or so. Think about these trees that came before Nebraska did. And then we've planted them. There's a picture on the left. I love that big, bold, wide-spreading bur oak in Kearney. On the right, North Platte and Gearing, out there in Gearing, a lot of nice bur oaks. So they literally grow all across the state with little effort. My second favorite oak would probably be the chinkapin oak. It's native into southeast Nebraska, as the range map on the upper right shows. It's really underutilized. It's well adapted to western Nebraska because it is native to calcareous high pH soils, and it'll tolerate our drier high pH soils of western Nebraska. So the far left image is the state champion tree south of Nebraska City. In the middle is a tree at the Kimball Fairgrounds, and on the right are young trees planted in downtown Omaha. There's a cousin of the chinkapin oak, and I think if we looked at them genetically, the dwarf chinkapin oak and the chinkapin oak would almost be identical genetically, but because they can hybridize readily, the dwarf chinkapin oak, though, is a shrubby plant generally when it's a pure collected plant. It wants to be shrubby and resprout after a fire. It's great for wildlife, great for the backyard, a great plant for where you might want an easy to grow shrub. Southeast Nebraska, there's Bob and Brad again, and a group of us collecting acorns off the Stalder property last year, where they have dwarf chinkapin oak and most of the other native oaks from our region. There's white oak, Quercus alba, barely native into Nebraska, but it's the most prominent oak across the eastern U.S., from Maine down to Florida and west over to Texas, back north to Minnesota. It barely reaches eastern Nebraska. We don't plant it much out here, but it makes a good tree. There's the state champion tree on the left in Antelope Park here in Lincoln, 75 feet tall and a 95-foot spread. The white oak gets its name from its white shading of its lumber, but also the whitish nature of its bark. Oops, what did I do? We don't want that. White oak is really covered well by Doug Tallamy in his Nature of Oaks. He looks at one white oak growing in his yard throughout a year from January to December and covers what's going on in it. And you'll get to see in there a wonderful variety of insects existing on that tree, including the banded hairstreak and polyphemus or silk moths. On the left, you'll see that white oak gets a great fall color. And then I put this note in here, Albuquerque, New Mexico. That name literally means white oak. It's not actually named for North America's white oaks, but the white oaks of Spain, because it was named for the Spanish Duke of Albuquerque from Albuquerque, Spain, of all places. Swamp white oak is a cousin of the white oak. What makes it unusual is its pedunculate acorns. These acorns grow on a little stem. It's quercus by color because it has two-tone to the leaves, a shiny bright green above and then velvety on the underside. In Lincoln, if you want to see a great stand of swamp white oaks, go visit Woods Park and drive along 33rd at O Street, and you're going to see a really fantastic group of swamp white oaks. Here's red oak, Quercus rubra. Red because of the color of its lumber, but also because of the color of its fall leaves. Red oaks are fantastic. They grow big, they grow old. The two trees on the lower right are our state co-champions, one in Fremont on the left and the other one in Lincoln on the right. Nearly 20 feet in circumference are those trunks. Fantastic trees we should plant more of. A cousin of the red oak is the black oak. Excuse me, it's named black because its bark gets this blackish, deeply blocky and grooved, rough bark over time. It's a native tree to the southeast part of the state, underutilized. The tree on the left is one in my yard. I collected as an acorn out of Schramm Park years ago, and it's been a fantastic tree for me. It also has marcescent leaves that hold on well into the winter. And let me just mention that Quercus velutina means velvet, and that's the velvety nature of the underside of those black oak leaves, which separate them from what a red oak leaf would look like. The blackjack oak is barely native into southeast Nebraska, and if you get a chance, go to the Table Rock Wildlife Management area just north of Table Rock, and you'll see the only native population with public access in Nebraska, and there are just a few trees in there. It's a little bit finicky to grow in the landscape, but the one on the left is growing in Waverly, and look at that fall color we had last year. The blackjack name refers to, there used to be a mace or a blackjack kind of a weapon that was used in ancient times, and the leaf kind of looks like that. That's where the name comes. It closely is related to our black oak, and the two actually hybridize where they come together. And now just quickly looking at some regionally native species that we should plant more of. The shingle oak, we should plant more of this. It's easy to grow in southeast Nebraska. It holds its leaves most of the winter, so it provides good winter wind blocking and also wildlife habitat. The tree on the lower right is the state champion on the UNL city campus. Shumard oak, definitely a tree we got to keep our eye on with our changing climate. This is a southern Great Plains, eastern Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas tree, tough as nails for heat and drought, and it is doing great in eastern Nebraska with very little care and great reliable fall color. The post oak is a cousin of the bur oak. It's hard to tell those two apart where they grow together. The post oak is more scrubby and shrubby. Its name, Quercus stellata, comes from the supposed star-shaped character of the leaf. I think of it more as a cruciform-shaped leaf, which is pretty distinctive as an oak goes. It can be used in southeast Nebraska, but it's not a very graceful tree, so we hardly ever see it. And then a tree for southern and western Nebraska to think about, especially the tree. This is Gamble oak. The one on the left is out in Kimball County at the fairgrounds. These trees are so tough. There's a population of Gamble oak in the picture on the lower right from Cottonwood Creek Canyon in southeast Colorado. We've been collecting and growing here for a few years to utilize more across southern and western Nebraska. Gamble oak is a cousin of the bur oak. It can become just like a bur oak, a small bur oak over time, or you can keep it shrubby in nature. We don't have time to talk about it today, but just be aware that there are many, many other oaks that we can try in our region. Here are some near natives that I've grown in Waverly and have had no trouble with. And so for me out in Waverly, where I'm planting an arboretum in our Wayne Park, we have over 30 types of oaks that are doing great out there. And oaks are just saying, hey, plant more of us. There's a lot of us to use and a lot of us to work with. So I would say maybe make any landscape include some oaks as kind of a backbone keystone species to organize your landscape around. And then by God Almighty, yes, throw in some cherries, some plums, And now let's think about even adding willows, especially where we have some consistent moisture. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys. We are just about out of time, but there is one question. Justin and I will let you address this. Tammy's asking about Quercus natali and whether that's native, which I don't think it is based on your presentation, but do you know anything about that?
Yeah. Okay. I showed the Shumard oak. Shumard oak is one of the trees that's in this group of trees that includes the nuttall oak, Quercus natalii, and so is the Buckley oak. I would not mess with the true Nuttall's oak tree in Nebraska. We've put it out in a few trial sites, and it's just too, it's not cold hardy enough. But a very good substitute is the Shumard oak or the Buckley oak, which is closely related to that Nuttall's oak. So that's an Oklahoma, Texas tree. And we're really high on the Buckley oak for its drought tolerance and heat tolerance. It's even more southern, but we have a lot of them going in eastern Nebraska. So try that one.
That's good advice. And then a question about cherries and willows. Is there good availability for either or both of those in the nursery?
Yeah, just real quickly, I think the answer is no. There's not a lot of availability, and it's going to be tough to find really any of those species at a nursery. Great Plains Nursery does carry a peach leaf willow. I've seen them carry black willow, and the statewide arboretum has been pushing Salix humilis or prairie willow for a while, but a lot of those other ones are going to be difficult to find. In terms of prunus species, you might be able to find black cherry through Great Plains Nursery, but you might get laughed out of the place if you ask for a choke cherry or a plum if you go to the nursery.
The statewide arboretum usually
black
has those. Yeah.
Yeah. We care. I'm not sure what we have this year, but in the past we've definitely had black cherry. And I want to say choke cherry too.
Yeah, we have.
And probably wild plums too.
Plum too.
Yeah.
And
so
be aware that our natural resources districts all sell choke cherry, sand cherry, and plum. You not just available to everybody, but if you've got an acreage or a conservation thing going on, you can buy them there at really easy cost.
Absolutely.
Can I just confirm that yes, we have those prunus species available in our greenhouses for sale. So that's good to know. Mostly there are just some other comments about folks that have different species that you mentioned. Amber said she has yellow willow, which they call basket willow from the late Bud Dazenbrock. So I don't know if you saw that comment, but that was an interesting comment. And Steve wanted folks to beware of crack willow. Have you heard of that, Brad? It's invasive.
Sure. Yeah. Yep. This is an invasive species. It's, something that's showing up and is very problematic in Western places. So thank you, Steve. It's something to be aware of. There are species in these genera that could be potentially invasive as well, right?
Good. Thank you for that, Steve. Well, that about does it for our talk today. Thank you, Justin and Brad, and of course, Bob, who had to leave for an appointment a little bit early, but we appreciate you taking the time and sharing your knowledge. So just a quick shout out. I wanted to mention, if you can't get enough of Plant Talks, the Nebraska Forest Service is hosting a series of webinars. They do them on Fridays, and there is one tomorrow at 12 noon Central Time. And it's going to be a roundtable of folks from across the state talking about their favorite trees. So I think that'll be interesting. Justin, do you want to say anything else about that?
Yeah, if you give me a second, I'll put up the link to the registration page. Yeah, come on in, people. We're going to have fun tomorrow with 5 people taking a fun look at some of their favorite trees.
If you just go to nfs.unl.edu and up at the top, they have an event and workshop button. You'll see the webinars listed there and you can register through that button. But yeah, Justin, you can put that link up. And then also, I just wanted to remind folks, spring is here or coming very soon. And that means Spring Affair is around the corner. This year, our big Spring Affair plant sale will be held April 24th through the 26th at Sand Hills Global Event Center in Lincoln. We have tons of information about it on our website, plantnebraska.org. We have tickets for sale for our preview party and our preview sale, which is tons of fun and is also a huge fundraiser for Nebraska Statewide Arboretum. So it's a great way to hang out with plant people, get awesome plants, and support an organization that you love. So thanks for considering that. And I think that's it. Anything else, you guys?
Michelle, I couldn't get the link to load up. Unfortunately, you're not going to find the link to tomorrow's webinar on our NFS event page, but maybe if they sent me an email.
Oh, shoot.
Give them the link. My email working well right now, but.
Okay, so it's not at nfs.unl.
No, unfortunately, it's not part of that.
Okay. Well, Justin,
I'll put it in right now for those.
Yeah. Put your email.
Okay, there's the link to it.
Okay, good. Thank you. And Renee, I'm not sure which website you mean, if it's plantnebraska.org for Spring Affair, or if it's Nebraska Forest Service, which Justin just put the link in. So hopefully that will help. Okay, everyone. Thank you for spending your time with us today. We will see you around.